Good evening, everyone. Again, there is no Parsha this week, but the holiday of Sukkot is coming up, so we're going to discuss a topic that relates to the holiday of Sukkot. So we will talk about a Parsha. We'll talk about something written in the Torah, which is Parshas Emor, Perek Chav Gimel, chapter 23 in the book of Vayikra, Pasuk Membeis, verse 42, which is the source of where we get the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah on what we call the Yontif of Sukkot. And this is, the pasuk reads, Basukos teishvu shivas yamim. You shall sit in a sukkah, we'll translate as a hut, for 7 days. Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshvu basukos. All those who are ezrach, all those who are citizens, naturally born of the Jewish people, which Rashi says the words are including both those born Jewish, both those who convert, they shall sit in a sukkah. Laman yedu dareseichem, so that your generations shall know, ki basukos hoishafti es bnei Yisrael, that in Sukkos, again we'll just use the word general Sukkos, hoishafti es bnei Yisrael, I sat the Jewish people, or I made them dwell, when I took them out of the land of Egypt, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am Hashem your God. So it's very interesting here that the Torah tells us a reason for the mitzvah. Torah says, sit in a sukkah, so the generations will know that I had the Jewish people dwell in sukkahs when I took them out from Egypt. That's what Torah says. You're doing the mitzvah so that you'll know that I sat, Hashem says, you'll know that I sat the Jewish people in sukkahs, which we don't know what those sukkahs mean right now, but I sat the Jewish people in sukkahs when I took them out from Egypt. And because of the fact that the Torah actually gives us a reason for the mitzvah, that the commentaries in halacha say that when you do the mitzvah sitting in a sukkah, you're supposed to have in mind that I'm fulfilling the mitzvah. Anytime you do a mitzvah, you have to have intent to do a mitzvah. You're not just doing it for the sake of no reason. You're doing it, you have the intent to fulfill a mitzvah. You should also have in mind to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah, which is to remember that Hashem sat us in sukkahs when he took us out from the land of Egypt. It's a thought you're supposed to think that. When you do the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah, which is primarily eating in a sukkah, tomorrow night, you're going to sit in the sukkah, you're going to have the volume of a kazayas of bread to fulfill your mitzvah, and as you do that, you shall have in mind that I'm doing the mitzvah of sukkah, which is a mitzvah so that we should remember how Hashem sat us in sukkahs when he took us out from Egypt. Now, what does it mean he sat us in sukkahs? What kind of sukkahs did he sit us in? So Rashi in his commentary says that sukkahs, the word sukkah means something that gives shade, something that covers. That's what the word sukkah means. We talk about schach, the roof, the thatched roof. Schach is something that covers, that gives shade. So kibasukkahs shafti. What were the sukkahs that I sat the Jewish people in? Says Rashi, anane kavod. What we call the clouds of honor, the clouds of glory. When the Jewish people traveled in the desert, they were surrounded by clouds, by clouds that Hashem sent. This was miraculous. Clouds that protected them from the sun, from the heat, from any kind of dangerous creatures in the desert. It was in front of them, in the back. There were 7 clouds that escorted them and protected them while they traveled in the desert. So Rashi says that when the Torah says we sit in a sukkah to remember the sukkahs that we sat in when we left Egypt, are talking about not sukkahs, not huts, but talking about the clouds of glory that surrounded the Jewish people and protected them when they were in the desert. Now, actually, Rashi is explaining the pasuk according to one opinion. If you look in the Mishnah, in Masechah Sukkah, in Tractate Sukkah, there's actually an argument as to what the Torah is referring to when it says Basukos. The opinion, and this is an argument in a Mishnah that goes back to the time to the period of the Mishnah. The sages of the Mishnah, Belez and Rabbi Akiva, argued as to what the Sukkos here is what we're referring to with Sukkos. According to Belezer, the Sukkos are what I just mentioned, the clouds of glory. According to Rabbi Akiva says Sukkos mamish. We're talking about regular huts. We are remembering how we lived in huts when Hashem took us out from Egypt. Rashi, now when Rashi is explaining, Rashi is always trying to explain the verses according to the way he sees it as pshat, as the most basic interpretation. That means that Rashi decided between the two opinions in the Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar's opinion that it's talking about the clouds of glory fits more into the base simple interpretation than to say the huts, which is very interesting, right? Because the word sukkah, as we're going to see, others say sukkah literally means a hut. And Rashi says no. In the context, even in the context of the pshat, of the simple interpretation, there is the simple interpretation should be clouds of glory. And the commentaries such as the Kli Yakar, others explain that the reason why Rashi said that the interpretation of the verse should follow Rabbi Elazar's interpretation that's going on the clouds of glory is because the wording is so that your generation shall know that in Sukkot Hayshafti. Hayshafti means I made them sit, I made them dwell. Now, if we're talking about something that is just natural and regular, they built huts, they put together huts, and they sat in them, and for some reason we're supposed to remember them, the pasuk should say, so that your generations should know that in Sukkot the Jewish people sat. But Kiba Sukkot Yashvu b'nei Yisrael. In Sukkot, the Jewish people sat. That's where they lived. That's what they dwelled in. Why does it say Hayshafti? Why is Hashem saying it? I made them dwell in it. So therefore, that word, according to Rashi, implies that we're talking about something more than just something simple that you build and live in. It's talking about where Hashem set them, where Hashem settled, what Hashem settled them in. And therefore Rashi says, what did Hashem sit them in? What did Hashem make them dwell in? The answer is, those were the clouds of glory. Something miraculous makes sense to say the word Hoshafti, I made them dwell. But if it's something natural, the word should be Yashvu. They sat. That would be the regular way of describing what they did. Okay, so therefore Rashi learned that it's still in the clouds of glory. But another commentary on the Torah called Rashbam, who was Rashi's grandson, he actually learns not like Rashi. He says, in simple interpretation, is like the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that it means a regular hut. That we're remembering that we sat in huts when we left Egypt. So the question is, if we're talking about a miracle, like cloud, like the 7 miraculous clouds, okay, remembering a miracle. But what's there to remember about the fact that they sat in sukkahs, that they sat in huts? What's to remember about that? So therefore, the Rashbam says the following. The Rashbam explains that we have to understand that what the Torah is trying to tell us here is in the context of the season of the year. Now, in the beginning, when the Torah first talks about, one second. Yeah. Earlier, when the Torah talks about the festival of Sukkot, it says, this is in, again, Parak Chav Gimel, chapter 23, Pasuk Lametes, verse 39, Ach b'chamisha asar yom l'chodesh hashvi, but on the 15th day of the 7th month, ba'as bechem es tevuas ha'aretz, when you gather in the grain of the land. Sukkot, there is a stress here that Sukkot is being celebrated when you gather in the grain of your land. Sukkot is called Chag HaAsif, the festival of ingathering. That means by the time Sukkot comes, the new grain of the year, it started growing already in the month of Nisan. It was harvested by Shavuos, and by the time it was Sukkot, it was all gathered in. There is a focus, there is a stress on the fact that Sukkot is celebrated during this season of the ingathering.
Was Torah mentioned about this?
Yeah. When you gather in the land. There's another place Torah mentions it also. Okay? So now, therefore, says the Rashbam, the point here is Torah tells us in another place, it says another pasuk, it says it even more explicit. You're celebrating it when you gather in your grain and everything. And at that point of time, your house is ready, right? You're all set. You have all the food that you need for the winter. Everything's in the silos. Everything is being stored away. You're all set for the year. You've finished the growing season. You've accomplished that you grew all these things. And now you're settling down. Now, when that happens, when basically you have all your needs being met and everything is good and everything is settled, that a person can start thinking about the fact, start patting himself on the back and saying to himself, good job, forgetting about the fact that nothing that he could have done is without Hashem's blessing. That is the problem here. The problem here is that there is an issue that after the ingathering and you have everything that you need and everything seems to be secure and comfortable, that a person then starts to forget about Hashem and starts to think more about and get caught up in themselves, become arrogant, and stop thinking about the fact that Hashem is who gives them everything that they need. Therefore, what does the Torah say a person should do? Therefore, the Torah says that what you're going to do during this period of the time is you're going to leave your house, your nice, comfortable house, the house that you're most comfortable with and most secure in, and you're going to sit in a hut. And you're going to sit in a hut because you're going to remember how you lived and survived, how your ancestors lived and survived when they were in the desert. Meaning, you didn't always have it this good. You didn't always have this comfort and this security of food and everything that you need. You didn't always have it. Your ancestors in the desert had nothing. And they lived in huts, and they were given everything, and they were able to survive for 40 years in the desert because of Hashem's kindness. So the purpose of Sukkot, says the Rashbam, is that you remember the period of time where we had nothing, but we survived. Why? Because Hashem gave us everything that we needed, and He supplied us, and He sustained us. And by remembering that, you'll remember that even now, when you did the work, and you put in the effort, and you did everything that you could have wisely and in the most professional and smart way of getting it done, that remembering how they survived in the desert and how they lived in the desert is the way to remember, to be reminded that everything we're sustained with comes from Hashem. It's not like when we're in the desert, we needed Hashem. Now that we're here, we don't need Hashem, which we actually spoke about a little bit on Rosh Hashanah. That's not the way it is. A person there are people who may still convince themselves like that, but in essence, a person is supposed to remember how the Jewish people survived in the desert. That was all through the hand of Hashem, and that doesn't change now, even though things are happening more in a natural way. So therefore, according to the Rashbam says the simple interpretation shows like Rabbi Akiva. A sukkah means a hut. According to the Rashbam, it's not about remembering the hut. The hut is what they lived in, but that's symbolic of the fact that they lived in the desert. It's a way of remembering how they lived, and because they lived and they lived in a hut, what they lived in wasn't miraculous, but the whole idea of surviving in the desert was miraculous. They were given everything that they needed. I mean, there are people who go through the desert. They live in the desert. Nomads live in the desert. So the Jewish people, they were living in these huts, but at the end of the day, where did they get all their sustenance from? They had the mun, they had the water, all through miracles. They were sustained in a place that was really unsustainable. I should say more than that. I don't know exactly how nomads do their things, but the commentaries mention that the Jewish people were in the parts of the desert were the most that was the most uninhabitable. They were in the desert, in the air of the desert that was least survivable. But they survived it. They survived it because Hashem miraculously allowed them to survive it. That's how they got their sustenance. Where they were, they had no way of sustenance, no way of water. But they survived it because of Hashem's kindness. So during the harvest season, during the ingathering season rather, where you have everything and you can start forgetting that it was Hashem who blessed you with this, go out to a sukkah, remember how the Jewish people lived in the desert, be reminded of how they lived only because of Hashem's miracles, and bring yourself back to the reality that even now that naturally you seem to produce this all, it's not you, but it's all Hashem. So this Rashbam really helps us to understand, according to Rabbi Akiva, that we're not commemorating something specifically miraculous with the huts. What are we doing it for? The answer is because it's not about remembering any kind of a miracle. I mean, it's not about remembering a specific miracle. Rather, it's about really remembering how we survived in the desert. And the point of remembering how we survived in the desert is to counteract any kind of negative influence that the ingathering of everything that we need and have may have upon us.
But in both cases, reference only for desert. We live in the desert. This is not in reference to Mitzrayim.
No, it's leaving after they left
After
Egypt.
it.
Yes, after left Egypt. Okay. Now, so that really helps us to understand. There are others who say a similar explanation. Rabbeinu Bachya gives a similar explanation according to Rabbi Akiva, that we are remembering the purpose of Rabbi Akiva says Sukkot means regular huts. What's the point? The point is, according to Rabbeinu Bachya, which is similar to the Rashbam, he just doesn't talk about the business, anything about the ingathering and countering any kind of negative influence from that. He says that the point of remembering the huts is not about the huts. It's about remembering our survival in the desert. It's not something specific to leaving Egypt, but it's about when we left Egypt and we were now in a desert. And Hashem did so many miracles for us in the desert. We're going to be we're commemorating that. Sitting in the sukkah, which was how and what we lived in, is meant to be our symbol of sorts to our living in the desert all those years and our miraculous survival in the desert. So it's similar to the Rashbam in the fact that it's not about the huts themselves, but it's about what the huts represent, which is how we lived when we left Egypt in the desert, and the fact that we were able to survive in that desert the way we did because of Hashem's miracles. Okay, so these are important ways of understanding Rabbi Akiva. But now we have to go back to Rebbe Lezer. Now, according to Rebbe Lezer, that the sukkahs are to remember the clouds of glory. So we have a miracle, right? It's a big miracle to have the clouds of glory. The question is, though, that this wasn't the only miracle the Jewish people had in the desert. They had the clouds of glory surrounding them. They had the mun, right? The food that fell from heaven. They had the water that came through them through a rock that supplied with all the water. You know, there were basically three big miracles the Jewish people had in the desert on a constant basis: the clouds, the water, the mun. So why are we only focusing on the clouds and not on the other ones? Why that one specifically? That's a question that many of the commentaries ask. And one answer that's given is like this, and it's a very interesting answer. One answer that's given is that in essence, it's not so much about the miracle of the clouds itself, but rather the way the Chida explains it is that, you know, if you look at these three miracles, okay, the clouds, the water, the food, were they all necessary? Let's go through them. Food, you got to have, right? Yeah. Water, you got to have, right? Do they have to have the clouds of glory? Could they have survived without them? No. You know, nomads survive in the desert, right? Right? They don't need, they have huts, they have tents, they have their buildings, they have their things they live in. So he argues that the clouds of glory was not a necessity, which means Hashem took them out of Egypt. He took them into the desert. No, he takes them out to the desert. They need to survive, right? They need to survive. They need to be taken care of, right? You're going to take them out to the desert and they have to start somehow or another traveling around to areas around the desert to get their food. Hashem supplied them what they needed. They needed food. They needed water. But they didn't need the clouds of glory. And if Hashem gave them those clouds of glory, plus the benefits of it, that was a sign of Hashem's love. Because Hashem didn't have to give them the clouds of glory, and he did, that was an expression of Hashem's love for the Jewish people. And therefore, that's what we're commemorating. When we commemorate the clouds of glory, it's not about the miracle itself, but it's about, according to the way the Chidah is learning, it's about it's the message of the clouds. The message of the clouds was Hashem's expression of love for the Jewish people, because they didn't need those clouds. Hashem gave it to them anyway. That was expression of love. That expression of love is what we're remembering.
But at the same time, this cloud of glory have practical things.
Yeah, but again, those were they did things for them. They clearly had benefits from it.
They walked directly.
Right, but that was all extra. That was all extra. They didn't need that for their survival. They didn't need it for their survival. They could have gotten without it. My understanding is because there are people who go through the desert. It's not like people who don't survive in a desert. So you need water, you need food. But those extra things, you know, it says it cleaned their clothing, the clouds of glory clean their clothing and stuff like that. That's not necessarily a necessity, at least through that. There are other ways of doing it. So he therefore argues the clouds of glory was an expression of Hashem's love, and therefore that's how we remember that miracle more than the other
No,
miracles.
this is not convince me.
Why?
But it's not very glorious. This show Hashem with you all time.
Right.
This is not love. This is just he exists.
No, that's love.
He live.
You don't need to have clouds of glory to be able to know that Hashem exists. Even according to you, right? Even according to you, that's something extra. It's the fact that Hashem lets them see. The fact that Hashem has His clouds of glory amongst them. That's also a very special. That's also a very special kind of thing that Hashem is doing.
For me, physical existence is secondary to moral. No, again.
But again, even if you say that, the point.
Glory, there is no survivor. I am not.
Why not?
They complain all time.
They complained about the food.
Yeah,
they complained about food. Good. So,
but at the same time, they have at least. No, again, this is for me. It's a very important part of the.
I'm not saying it's not an important part, but you have to understand it, right?
Not extra.
It's extra in the sense of, in comparison to the other two. If you want to talk about what they needed, they needed those two things. Now, everything else that Hashem gave them clearly had tremendous benefits to it. But that's the whole point. The whole point is all those benefits weren't there because of they needed it, but it's because of Hashem's special relationship to them. That itself is an expression of love.
But if return to our time, what is physically more important than
It's not about what's more important. It's not what's more important. First of all, physical is very important because you have to survive. And then there is also the spiritual, of course. So good, the spiritual experience that they had in the desert with the clouds was something that was a very, very special experience. And it's the focus on that special. If the question is why is it different than the other ones? Why we want to remember this one more than the other ones? The answer is this one showed the special relationship between them.
Okay, I agree with everything, but the word extra is not what I like.
Okay. Okay. Wishing everybody, thank you for listening, and wishing everybody a very good Yontif, Chag Sameach, and all the best.
This is my question, only one question. This